Hello and welcome to the GIS Day 2021 at Cal Poly Pomona. The theme of our GIS Day is inequality and role of GIS, and we're lucky to have so many great people with us today. And just going over the agenda for today, we have our Dean Roland going to have our session started, and then I'm going to just go over the theme of the presentations, and then we have three presenters. We have Dafna and Kendrick and Chloe. We're lucky to have all three today, and then we have Rita, who is going to provide some closing remarks, and finally we're going to just have a kind of discussion on the survey that we have shared with everyone, which is about the inequality in your local community. So without further ado, let me ask our Dean Roland to start the session. I just want to be thankful of all of the Dean's office personnel helping us through the years and helping to have this meeting. Also, we have been lucky to have our founder of the Singelyn Center, Ruth and David, helping us to really launch different meetings and different projects. And of course, we are also lucky to have so many people from ESRI through the years, especially Joseph Kersky, Jian Lang, Kansirna Kornia, and Chloe Teraslinna, that help us to kind of have a very strong relationship with ESRI as an industry leader in location intelligence and GIS. So thank you, Dean Roland, and please take it away.
Thank you all, and thanks for being here. Hopefully you can hear me clearly, and if you can't, then wave at me or something. I can see some of you on my screen along with these slides. But my name is Eric Roland, and I'm the Dean of the College of Business. And I am here because I have been a lifelong proponent of focusing on popularizing GIS, I would say. When I worked on my dissertation back in the 1980s, wow, that makes me really old. When I completed my PhD, one of the things that I did just after I completed my dissertation was engage in a project to do facility location allocation projects with graphical interfaces. And the kinds of tools that we had in the 1980s were very different. We didn't have the same ESRI tools as you guys are fortunate to be working on today. Everything we wanted to do, we had to actually do manually, write all the algorithms for facility allocation, scrape together data. It was a real interesting journey. But as a result of that, I really got into ESRI products in the early 1990s. I started a big center in the School of Business at UC Riverside back then in '91 with support of ESRI. And I have been involved with ESRI and with GIS ever since in my life. And it is a big part of who I am. But what I think is so unique about the constellation of talks that we have put together today is really this clear demonstration of how GIS really hooks into all aspects of life. I know that the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion are really big societal issues in the US right now. And I'm really happy to see that we have a panel of speakers today that will talk about the role of GIS in those contexts. And that's exciting. And this is something that most people don't understand about GIS. I mean, they think it is about mapping natural resources and forests and whatnot, but it's really about communicating, right? It's about communicating around using visualization and maps, right? And as we know, almost everything we do in life has some sort of a geographic location associated with it. And also we know from our elementary school education that a picture really communicates 1,000 words. So what better tool do you have to communicate with, particularly across language barriers and across regions and continents, across political system? What tool is better than the GIS tools that you have available today? This is really the key. GIS to me is a phenomenally powerful communication tool for almost anything. Whether it comes to working on projects like Saving the Tiger, which I have been involved with for a long time with the World Bank, or it comes to projects like developing new housing areas which we know we're always struggling with in the state of California. Affordable housing is not something we have. But in all of those domains, GIS is the kind of tool that we rely on to help visualize and to explain and to talk about the challenge and to find ways to solve the problems around. Although there are solution methods built into your GIS tools, and those are really important, just the fact that we're able to communicate with the tool itself is really incredibly powerful. And it's why I'm a big fan. And I believe all business schools and all universities should teach GIS to all their students, to teach them how to communicate with these kinds of visual tools. So that's kind of a little bit about, you know, why I think GIS is important. And we'll hear much more interesting things from the speakers today. But I want to just say welcome to everybody who's here live. And I'm looking forward to a series of really, really interesting topics that we're going to cover, and a real demonstration as to the fact that GIS is applicable everywhere to almost anything you can imagine. And a special thanks to all of you who come here as speakers with us today, and to our Singelyn Center for Innovative Analytics, Mehrdad and Rita and everybody else for putting this together. It's an impressive lineup. And we will certainly continue to market this talk today past the point when we close our browsers in a couple of hours. We will market this as available out there for people to see. So thank you all for being here. I hope you all take something away, something inspiration away from the talks today. And I hope to see you all in person soon again. So with that, back to Mehrdad. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dean Roland. That was a very fantastic talk, and then I really enjoyed a couple of examples you provided. Just going back to the theme of our talk today, is focused on the spatial inequality, and of course, looking at the spatial inequality from the lens of GIS, how GIS can be helpful. But what is a spatial inequality? And then I think we all agree that where people live exerts that strongly influence under opportunities in life. And that's why we need to understand the role of GIS, why it is important, and helping us to find opportunities and resources that, of course, many of them have spatial dimension. And with that, I will go to Dafna Golden. She's a professor of geography at San Antonio College, and she's going to talk about exploring food deserts in Los Angeles using GIS. Professor Golden received her master's in geography from Cal State LA and her bachelor's in geography from Humboldt State University. She has 20 years experience working with GIS and strong interest in applying mapping technologies to study ecosystem processes. She has been involved in many projects funded by NSF, and we're lucky to have her today. And without further ado, please take it away, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I'm really happy to be here. And I think that your program is really lucky to have such a supportive dean, and those were great opening remarks. And in my bio, it does say that for a long time, my interest has been in natural resources, but it has, because there's so much going on with equity, I did start working on some projects related to that help look at what resources communities have and if they're accessible to all of the communities. And so for one of the projects that I started looking at that I'm going to present today is exploring food deserts in Los Angeles using GIS. The concept of food deserts has been looked at for a long time, about 10 years. There's a lot of research at different levels, the national level. And this concept is another example of how we can look at if there are spatial inequalities and inequalities in access to resources, because that ends up affecting people's outcomes in lives. And I'm going to focus on different visualizations of how we can look at these patterns of access to food. So we're gonna look at a couple of maps. The first map here is looking at food deserts at the national scale. You can see the legend of the map where the researchers, this is not a map that I developed, but the researchers have identified areas that would be considered food deserts based on inaccessibility to supermarkets. And most food desert research does focus on accessibility to supermarkets, and it's pretty standard to define accessibility within a mile. That's considered walkability. You'll see later, I also included drivability because we're in Los Angeles and people don't really walk in LA. So I'm going to be looking at both aspects of that. One of the things that I want to emphasize is that maps can often be looked at as so final in the way that they present data that we don't often take the time to question things unless you're properly trained in understanding the process of map production and visualization. And so I just want to point out that, I mean, this is not a terrible map, but you know, like, why would they include Alaska and Hawaii if, according to the legend, there's no data related to them? So I just am trying to get students to understand that while maps seem like they are like true and factual, there's a lot that goes into presenting data, and it's always important to look at it with a little bit of a skeptical eye and look at the details of the data that's being presented. So as I said, most studies of food deserts focus on accessibility to supermarkets, and I wanted to look at Los Angeles in particular because I really believe in affecting change at the local scale. And every community has different resources and patterns and needs. This is also not a map that I did. This is from ArcGIS Online and somebody else's research. So you can easily look at this data yourself. This was another study that looked at food accessibility in Los Angeles, and in particular looking at supermarkets. And let's just look at the legend a little bit so you can understand what we're seeing here. The yellow areas are areas that have been identified with people in poverty. And the green areas are the supermarkets within a 1 mile walking distance. And I'm sorry, it's the red dots, I apologize. The red dots are the people with poverty, and the yellow areas are the supermarkets within a 10-mile drive. So the areas in red that you're seeing are the people in poverty that have neither walkability or drivability to supermarkets. So those would be considered the food deserts in Los Angeles, in particular because of the low income demographics of those communities as well. So I wanted to explore the idea that supermarkets are not the only way that people access fresh food. Another source of fresh food are farmers markets, which are more transitory. And this map, so this is one of my maps, this is a map of geocoded farmers markets in Los Angeles County. And this shows, it shows some patterns. So you can see from here that there is actually a density of farmers markets in the central part of Los Angeles. And we can use that to look and visualize that density in another way. So here's a map, it's called a heat map that shows density. And you can, and this really emphasizes where the farmers markets are or aren't. And that's another way of visualizing this data. Heat maps are easy to produce and fun to look at, but there's still more to the story. I wanted to explore how accessible are the farmers markets. Accessibility, again, is defined by drivability or walkability. So this map shows areas with a 10-minute drive time to a farmer's market. And the purple areas cover most of LA County. The white areas are really, if you're not familiar with LA County, just really quickly, this is the Angeles National Forest, and out here is desert area. So these are not really populated areas. So we can infer based on this map that LA County has adequate access to farmers markets by car. But what about walkability, access by foot? So here's another map that shows access to farmers markets within 1 mile. That's the definition of what's considered walkable. So there's definitely a lack of accessibility in terms of walkability to farmers market. But another important aspect of accessibility to food is the acceptance of food programs by supermarkets and by farmers markets. This is an important way for markets to serve their communities. So in this map, we see the farmers markets, and the different colors denote whether that farmers market accepts SNAP, which is the major food program, or WIC, or one or the other. So the red dots are the farmers markets that don't accept any food programs, and the blue dots accept both. And then the purple and the green are one or the other. So there's definitely, when we consider this aspect of accessibility, there's definitely a limit on how accessible farmers markets are. 57% of the farmers markets in Los Angeles County do not accept any food assistance program. And that becomes even more striking when we consider the income level of the communities. So here's the map of the farmers markets again, and overlaying on demographic data about poverty level. So the darker polygons are more people in poverty. And we can look at that relationship. I didn't explore it too much to dig down deep, but just with a visualization, you can see that there is a correlation between the farmers markets that aren't accepting any food programs occurring in communities where there's a high concentration of people living below the poverty level. And as a community advocate, the question would be, if you wanted to advocate for some of these farmers markets, to recommend to them to start accepting SNAP and or WIC, to target the efforts to one or two. And since we're drawing from the eastern part of LA County, we might consider looking at Pomona here, where there are 2 farmers markets, a medium amount of poverty level, and 2 farmers markets that are not accepting any food programs. So those might be some in our community that we would want to target for recommendations for greater acceptance of food programs to meet the communities. We could also, in further analysis, look at other demographic data like race and ethnicity, and see how those distributions are also related to poor accessibility. And other considerations that could be looked at in the future. Okay, so here's another comic strip. I think, this is just a comic strip about food deserts, but again, going back to what I was saying about visualization and the presentation of data, it all comes down to the data itself, and making sure that we're adequately capturing the right data as it's occurring in the real world. And so one thing to consider is that in some low income communities, they are serviced by different, there are different options to food accessibility, like trucks that come to those communities to deliver fresh produce. And that's another aspect that could be looked at, is mapping where those food trucks are in the communities that they're serving. Because it might be easy to look at a map, like at the beginning and say, oh, food desert here, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people don't have access to fresh food. The communities are being served in different ways, farmers markets, and these food trucks. When I say food trucks, I'm not talking about prepared food, but there are these delivery trucks that come to these communities and have fresh produce that they're selling. So I think that future studies could investigate that to really assess this concept of food accessibility. And wow, that went by really quick, but I'd be happy to answer any questions or have a discussion about this topic if anybody wanted to open it up and ask me anything. I just wanted to finally say that the maps that I developed was inspired by and modified from multiple lessons that were originally developed by ESRI's Learn GIS team. And you can find other similar lessons that focus on accessibility of different resources at the ESRI website.
Wow, that was fantastic. That was very interesting to look at the accessibility to the food, and then there are so many choices, of course. And of course, what matters here is that the people with the access doesn't mean that they have the always the access to the right type of grocery store. So I would like to ask everyone who has a question or anything that you want to add, please go ahead and take your time. And you can open your mic, you can put your question in the chat, and then I can ask Dafna for that question.
So I'd like to ask a question. Thank you, Dafna. That was fascinating. How easy is it to get data about food delivery trucks? I mean, I imagine the farmers markets and supermarkets, that's relatively easier. How easy is it to get data about the food delivery trucks?
I don't think it would be easy at all. I'm not sure. You'd have to really go into the communities and figure out where those services are originating from. And I don't think there's anything simple about it, but I think it would be a really interesting study to do. So I haven't seen any data about that myself.
I think one possibility could be crowdsourced data. People who know or are going to the neighborhood, they may post like there is a food truck here, fresh produce, and people who have access to Google Maps or Waze, they can see that like a pop-up. But this is really interesting to see that. I think so many countries, they have this type of food trucks for the fresh produce. And that's not something we see more often in the US, but as you did analysis, there are so many areas that could benefit from that specific case.
Yeah.
Is there any other comment, question?
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, because from what you guys mentioned right now, so what can you do when you want to find a data set, but it's just like not available at all? Like, just curious.
Then you get excited and you start working on a project. And you, I mean, that's always the big issue in working on a GIS project, is getting the data and finding those limitations. And I mean, like in this case, I think it would really involve like crowdsourcing or going into the communities and really having to canvas for that information yourselves. It's not always easily accessible. There's a lot more than there used to be. So there's a lot that can be done now, but that is always remaining a limitation because we're always pushing the boundaries of what we want to investigate and dig deeper, and getting that data can often be a major limitation.
Sounds good.
Absolutely, and you may have realized that we sent you a survey, kind of ask you for your understanding of inequality in your community. And I think that's one way we can ask citizens or the city or any organization that is having a great connection with the citizen. They can create this type of data, and many projects, they actually have to create their own data. So that was, I think, a very interesting area to see that if there is a need for data, and data does not exist, does not mean that we cannot create that data. We cannot survey data. And then I think Koohi has nailed to that point that there are so many opportunities, and ESRI has so many tools. For example, ESRI has a tool called Survey 123. You can create easily a survey and then put it out, and people can put information and take a picture, put it on the map, exact address, and within a matter of seconds, you have a interesting data set to work with.
The other thing, of course, Mehrdad, is all the scraping that you can do, right, with some automation of some scripting tools and so forth. So there's a lot of opportunities in that, and that's often what we end up doing when we're doing research. We end up doing a lot of data scraping from different places, and so that's a good skill to have, and I'm sure many of you are very familiar with that. But that's certainly today a good skill to have, and my own experience with that is, well, we've been scraping, comments from places like TripAdvisor, right? About I have personally done projects on national parks and state parks in California and scraping data sets off of there, and then taking those data sets and doing analysis with GIS tools to try to understand whether it is uniqueness of the parks or why they're doing well or not doing well and all these kinds of things. So scraping is always available, and there are so many cool tools to do that now that you don't really have to be this super experienced programmer anymore. So that's just something to keep in mind as well when you're looking for data sets, because we as researchers, the professors in this call, we often do that kind of stuff because there is no other way to get to what we want. So but that is available to all of you. Thank you.
Yes, and I think that is nicely linked to our second presentation. So let me go ahead and I introduce Kendrick Faison. He is the CEO of SpatialGIS, and Mr. Faison started his GIS career as the image analysis in the NGA, National Geographic Agency, and then he moved later to the National Security Agency supporting the Booz Allen Hamilton. Mr. Faison holds 2 bachelors in arts and history and geography from Fayetteville State University in North Carolina, and a master's in geoscience from Morris State University. So I would like to ask Kendrick, without further ado, please go ahead and you can have the floor.
Hello guys, can you guys hear me?
Yes, thank you for joining us.
I'm in frigid Maryland, so you guys are probably in sunny, warm California. So again, appreciate you guys. My name is Kendrick Faison. I am the president CEO of SpatialGIS. when we talk about diversity and inclusion in regards to GIS, I am proud to say it, and I always tell people, I'm very unapologetically to say this, that I'm one of very few African-American geospatial CEOs in the country. I've been in the business for quite a while. I've worked state, local, and federal. I've had the proud honor to say that I'm one of very few individuals who have worked in national disaster. So there's one person that probably worked Katrina. I'm that second person to work Hurricane Sandy in New York. And so I've had a very good career in regards to GIS. I've worked at NGA, worked in the Intel space. I've stood up a couple of local governments, but now as a CEO, one thing that I'm also doing is also trying to build a company, but also ensure that this equity path for African-Americans at GIS, and especially if you see the school there, I actually attended Fayetteville State University. It is a historically Black college in North Carolina. We're only 2 HBCUs in the country that's USGIS certified, and we offer a degree in geosciences. So I'm actually the first person from my program to actually get my master's degree in GIS. So very glad to be here. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about is data management. And so, especially in the GeoInt community. So a lot of people may not know, and I'll talk about a case study when we get down the road, but it may seem mundane for the amount of folks that we have online. They usually don't know who I'm talking about. But really, the thing about data management is really kind of key in our environment. So I want to kind of talk about some pieces. very interactive. You can stop me whenever you want to. I want to talk about my company. So SpatialGIS, we provide 4 pieces of services. So GIS services, data analytics, training and emergency service. We also have drone capabilities as well. One of the things that we are big on is, as you guys can see, data management, right? And so agile development, staff augmentation, but also having folks that are mission essential. And so hopefully want to have this conversation about data management with you guys. So everybody knows, who uses GIS, right? And I think your department chair talked about, the use of GIS. And so now we're really kind of talking from a business perspective, but there are other people that use GIS. And I do commend him saying that every business school, I think every piece of education should touch it, right? Because when I was an undergrad, I had a professor said geography is the mother discipline of many, right? And so the arts and also science, it touches this in some way. So here are some disciplines that use GIS, and I know we just talked about food deserts, but that's one piece. So we have a very vast community of people, but also that vast community of people are leveraging data. And so we talked about, I think Mr. Rowland, if I'm not mistaken, is your department chair, but he talked about scrubbing data or finding data or going out to get that data, right? And so there's at one particular time, if you guys, I've been around, been doing GIS for a while, and I will yet to kind of, say I'm the elder state person GIS. But at one time when we started this thing out, we needed data, like we needed to find it. But now it's so readily available that we have so much of it that we have to manage the data. And Stephen Few came out with a book called Signals. And it basically talks about, we have no issue about collecting data, but how do we take the noise out of analysis and really get to the signals, right? And so again, in many disciplines, we use individuals use GIS. So then there's multiple ways of capturing the data. So you can capture data by creating vector files, digitizing, which, most people don't do that as much, but digitizing, scanning data, the conversion from raster data to vector data, right? Raster data coming from sensors. So we look at satellite imagery. We then derive products from like a Landsat data set we're doing land cover classifications, right? And then even some data models that we're starting to do in machine learning and AI. And then also I'd kind of doubled up on scanning, so I do apologize for that. And then, but one of the things that we all know about data is that spatial data is huge, right? Most of our data sets outside of data. So if we look at a raster data set, if we look at models that we use through Model Builder, or if we use FME, or we do some type of transformation, that data is huge. And so prime example is, one raster data set imagery, right, is like a gigabyte. And then now as we've gone from like terabytes to now petabytes, right? And so now we're kind of talking about cloud computing and how do we really not ingest, but also store and also manipulate that data and store that data, and also our piping. So there's latency in regards to systems. There are as issues that we've seen already with broadband. Some of these connections require a lot of piping to be able to do so. So we really got to understand that from a geospatial perspective as well. Most of the times we kind of get in front of a map and we kind of do our own small projects, but multiple things, especially in the GeoInc community, especially when we talk about raster data, these are large data sets, right? And so still keeping with the conversation about data. And then even still, so, data, we store data in spatial databases, and we use SQL, right, to cut down on that by using our relative databases, right? We use enterprise GIS to provide this data out to multiple people. And data is expensive. So not as much as it used to be, because like Here Technology or a data provider that goes out, and I think somebody talked about food deserts. So maybe there's a company that can go out and capture data and then sell it back out to local governments, right? And it can be very expensive. Then also I talked about that local data set that users use to kind of update the data, like the day-to-day data. Like if you have road closures or those type of things. Those are small and very, they don't put a lot of stress on our systems, right? And then we talk about processing the models, right? And so modeling meaning touching many various parts of a data structure, right? So it's not really, when we do models, we are writing expressions to eliminate data, but we're also writing expressions and doing processes to combine data or join data, right? So when we look at spatial joins, those are the things that that will increase the size of data. But also, as you guys know, when we do spatial joins, we join the fields of that data. So how do we, in the back of our mind, as we're doing these transformations, how are we thinking about managing these data sets? And then also the visualization and interpretation of how people kind of see an influx of data, right? And then the geoprocessing process, right? So how do we derive those environments? So as you guys know, if you go into a geodatabase, you have the ability to manipulate the environment, right? So you in the back end need to know the process of that geoprocessing, but what is the output? And what way do you want to do? You want to file geodatabase? Do you want to put it in a enterprise geodatabase? Do you want to push it out to a cloud environment? Those type of things. When we start to talk about the movement of data and the ebb and flow of data, those are the type of things. And then we talk about the architectural functions. And so what happens on the next end of that one input, right? And so that when I talk about if you guys are not familiar with ETLs, so that's extractions, transformation, and loads. So being able to take big data sets, and I think somebody talked about scrubbing data. So going to a website and pulling that data down and then pushing it back into another data set without really physically touching that data source is another way of doing that. But then also, I think now we have started to look at data in systems and products and starting to automate that, with the exceptions of machine learning and AI. But again, even though we're going through those processes, we need to understand what's that data flow and managing that data. I think this is a repeat of the previous one. So then GIS visualization. And so how do we, the data integration. So when we look at going back to that large data sets, how do we, the exploitation of data, how do we present that data in a way? And I think with the way the ESRI is done now with ArcGIS Online, like being able to package that data from a map product and service it out from a web map perspective, I think has changed the way that we've been able to allow people to even ingest data. So I think somebody just talked about Collector 123, right? That whole tool is a tool set, but it's really on the creator of the form is to understand what data elements they need and using domains, right? And so standard use of data are things that we really kind of have to put our minds to because in one instance, I say this all the time about simple language. Most of the time in GIS, we really, we just create products and data sets, but we really never put in mind and we always fuss about, everybody uses metadata, right? But it's not really that. We also need to understand simple language, right? And so we're in an organization or the federal government where we, and again, guys, I used to work in the federal government as well. And we had the same issues as well as what is the standard language? So let me give you an example. So Maryland in one data set could be M.dot. Well, another system that's been created that no one really knows about, they're doing M period, D period, right? Or in another system that we have Maryland spelled out, right? And so when we try to do analytics on it and we talk about, and people use this big word, business intelligence, we have to do there's a lot of coding that has to be wrapped around to take those three, at least those very minimum three. There may be multiple data formations and the way that the data is written out, that we have to go and do additional work. So when we are creating data sets and we are managing those data sets, when we talk about data management as a governance group, sometimes we have to get around the horn and kind of talk as a community to say, what is the standard language of how we produce data? And I'll talk about this a little bit later about security factors and those particular things. But then also from a visualization perspective, we have gone from 2D which is standard maps to 3D. And then now with this new metaverse, this AI and VR side of the world with the data. So if we're thinking about, you know, and I talked about how data sets have been so large about 10 years ago, now they've increased. So as we start to go through the metaverse and blockchain and these type of things that are going to allow us to kind of help parse out data, you know, what's to come, right? And so those are the type of things I think from a GIS visualization. And if you guys didn't see the last ESRI conference, we're looking at gaming, right? So there's a huge gaming engine, and I had opportunity to talk to Mr. Dangerman. I call him Jack. So you guys, for your purposes, I'll call him Mr. Dangerman, but I call him Jack because I've known him for like 19 years. But we talked about gaming like 4 years ago, and I was like, that sounds good. But at the last ESRI conference, they actually showed a incident where there was a fire, and you technically could use GIS to be able to do situation awareness and pre-planning on building being on fire, and what's the right ingress for a fire truck. So that still has a data relationship. And so here are the things I think that when we talk about data management, we still need to understand what is data, right? So these are a couple points that I want to kind of bring to your attention on, okay, there's this nice visualization, there's this nice map, but what is the true value of that is data, right? And so we'll talk about the data, these particular items that I think really relate to data. So data currency. So most data, GIS data static. So we're now moving to a sensor-based side of the house. But most of that data, if you look at your data sets, are data that is captured in a particular time, right? So we really hardly get data updates or a real-time data set. And like an AVL, which I don't know if you guys know AVL. AVL is automated vehicle locator. That is that's a sensor kind of data set, right? But that call to that data is still a strain on a database. So whether we lose or we gain data, and most of the time when you're doing data updates for real-time data, you're gaining more data than you're losing it, right? So there's still a strain in regards to understanding that data flow. And then another thing that we talked about is the copying of data. So it kind of it hasn't been as bad, but it's really, when we used to use shape files, it used to be horrible. And I know some of you guys like, what is a shape file? If you say that, great. I am most definitely not a proponent of shape files. I actually despise people using shape files. That's just my personal. But because it doesn't give you integrity of your data sets, right? So shape files again are file files. It can be manipulated, it can be saved, it can change. But then if you push it back into the environment, you know, without versioning, so we use now versioning and file geodatabases and geodatabases. And then also, most of the time, and we're all guilty of this, we'll go out, we'll make a map, or we'll actually create a data set, and we won't document anything, right? So there is no like who did it, like what day it was it derived from, whatever those particular things are. And then the analytic results of those invalid pieces of that when that data was last used. So if there is that full desert data that we captured and without the metadata on the back end of it, like, you know, if it was captured 5 months ago, and then the governor says, hey, could you give me an out brief of, you know, I don't know what grocery stores you guys have in Ralph's, right? So what was the last crate pickup at Ralph's, right? If we really don't understand that the data that we're using was 5 years old, like we'll make an assumption or a predictability based upon using static data and old data, right? So again, you know, where are the best sources? So really kind of talk about the authoritative data sets. And then also now we go into data quality, right? So, you know, most GIS data has errors. You know why? Because we're all human. And so we are, and humans and machines and things make mistakes, right? There's no perfect data set, right? And you know, there's a book that says, you know, you lie with a map, right? So, but again, measuring devices still may put off wrong, calibrations may be off. Humans, you know, may have a bad day, or, you know, I thought I saved it, or I fat fingered a particular value in it was wrong. Processing may tank up, you know, or databases may get corrupted in a sense, right? And then like relative scales and things that may go on. But then again, you know, people trust digital data. They think it's truth. If we put out something now, and have you guys used Waves and went down the street and like, oh, wow, this is a dead end. But again, you trusted Waves enough because traditionally Waves would have never took in the wrong direction. But again, that shows just the avid understanding that data still, there are still some flaws in data, right? And there's still limitations on data, and it must be understood before you use it. We're not going back to that Waves piece. And even some of our map products are still that kind of way too. And again, most data shouldn't contain personal data and private data, but again, in many cases it does. And then also in many cases we failed to put security or some mechanisms around those data sets. And then also like location data for crimes. You know, when we talk about crime analysis, there may be some sensitive data inside of that. But again, we need to also understand from a data owner perspective is, you know, how sensitive that data is and how should we, you know, put controls on it. So I think many times we don't think about controls, we just put data in. And I think that's one of the things when we talk about data quality is very key. And then data ownership. So sometimes we get data and we're like, where do we get this data from? Like, we keep using the same data set. Like somebody was there 2 years ago, we constantly use the data set, right? Because again, it doesn't wrap in metadata. And then the custodial ownership is typical. So, and most of the time people don't, you know, but no one really understands the data. So when we talk about custodial data, you know, I'm in the business department, here is finance. We give a copy of this data set to finance, and finance is saying, hey, this is the annual data set, not knowing that the GIS department has a battle rhythm or they change their battle rhythm to say, we're going to update it. We've traditionally made this an annual data set. Now we're making this a quarterly or biannual piece. And that communication in regards to that data give, because once we give data, we really never hardly track where that data goes. Now using REST services that we now have, we have a little more control on how that data is being served. So that's why it's very important. And I really like the ability to do REST services. So there's a data owner, and that data owner controls that path in regards to it. But it's still, there's still many times we provide data and not have any true coverage in that. And then we also lack that metadata. And I think, if anything, and I'm guilty of this, I think metadata is like a bad word, right? Because it's an extra layer of more work to do, right? But metadata will save you in many cases. And then documentation, so bam, that's what we talked about. So there's many standards. We have to understand it. We have to let people that are using the data understand the data. And I think sometimes we just build stuff and like, hey, here's a pretty map, here's a dot. Here is the symbology and topology behind it. Here's the lat long, and have at it, right? But again, we need to also follow standards. So FGDC standards, ISO standards, OGC standards, there's standards wrapped around the data. And many times, all times, we don't follow that from our documentation. And then collaborative spaces, sharing initiatives about, hey, what is the system of record? How do we use those particular things as well? And then also some solutions that many of us use with data hinges on the use of metadata. And so if you don't put metadata in it, most people won't make the right decisions on the use of data. And then avoid data wars, right? And getting buried in detail. So what the data wars is me, mine, is not us. And I think that's really one of the things that when we talk about data sets, and I think maybe after September 11th, I think even in the federal government, people were like, hey, let's share data, right? Because there were so many issues. And you'll see, and I say this a lot, especially when I worked at FEMA, we really don't think about things or make course correction until something bad happens, right? Sounds crazy, right? And so that goes along with data. And then again, start simple, right? I believe in the simplicity of projects and work, concept approaches of that. And so before we start to think about how do we build this massive data geodatabase or this massive process, right? Iterate that process, right? And I think ESRI, the reason that it has iteration in model builder is iteration. It means take this step to go this step to go this step to go this step. And I think many times I was at FEMA and our deputy administrator said, we did this COP, huge, it's like 25 years of data at FEMA. And he walked out the door and he said, hey guys, this Christmas tree looks very good. Just don't put a lot of ornaments on it, right? And so basically what he was saying is, it looks good now, keep doing it, and just gradually make adjustments to it. Because traditionally what we would do is we'll try to build the solution of the solutions. And so Scrum methodology and agile development allows us to kind of help us do that. And so that's one of the things about documentation. And documentation is not really for you, but it's for people behind you and who's going to use the data. And again, we should typically talk about, the map projections, our standards, and perforating that across agencies and using that to be a standard. And sometimes about getting around the table and talking about data is something that we rarely do. And again, how do we fix things? How do we collect data? And data standards and maintenance comparables are very key. Same duplication of slides, sorry about that, guys. And so, with data standards, everybody working together, the question we should always ask ourselves is who's actually making that decision on those data standards? And then how's the cost created? So if you guys don't know, there's always cost with data because there's a decision that has to be made. So if we're looking at hiring data, we're looking at production data. I know Amazon is big, like shipping data. There's going to be an added cost in regards of a decision that has to be made from it, right? So who's covering that? And even if you don't make that data change, what organization or what leader will take that responsibility on from that data change? And then here's some difficulties, right? So we have some things that we should think about, and I kind of walk through them a little bit. But how frequently do we store data, right? Where is it located in the organization? Is a small portion of data going to be, sit in finance, does it sit in police, does it sit in public safety? Is it a universal data set? Is it in a data lake? Is it in a data mart? These are particular things. When we talk about GIS mapping, we kind of get out of the loop with it because we feel, again, if it's not in our map, we don't really care about it. But remember that these conversations have to be made so that we kind of have more stronger and authoritative data sets to be able to make map products that answer the question for our end user. And then also, again, some of these things about raw data, how's it stored? Is it stored in different computer systems? Is it, legal ramifications on it? When I talked about that crime data. And then also selecting the data management tools is also another problem that we kind of face in regards to data management. Because I think, again, even though it's depicted in GIS, as you guys know, it still has it's stored in a file geodatabase. It's still stored in a bucket, right? So like S3 buckets for Amazon. And then what is that data security and that quality and integrity, and how does that jeopardize the work that we do, right? So those are the things that really we've kind of not, we don't put our heads around with data management. And then how do we improve data? So this is really, I think, where we should also put our heads on as we start to streamline data. Is it automation? How do we look at location? What about the data sources? How do we, put the data to test, and then like inconsistent in formatting the data, right? So as an organization and as data users, but also data creators, like how do we improve those data quality, the quality of data? You ever heard of the thing garbage in, garbage out in regards to data sets? This is very key. And so we have to, have the ability to find the latest data set. And then as we find that data set, you understand there's a term called sunset. So do we put that data set? We never want to delete data. And some people have retention programs because we may have to go through it, like, let's say if there's an earthquake in California and there was a data set that was done, like I think the last earthquake was in 95. So maybe if you want to rerun a model or rerun a scenario, we want to pull that data from 95 back out. But we understand the issues and the confidence value of that data. It may not be as much, but it at least will give us some sensitive information to make real-time decisions on an issue that we may be facing in the near future, right? i.e. earthquake again, right? And then also the biggest thing about data management is saving time and money, right? So with anything that you do with data management is being able to automate data. So I think as less hands that you have on a data stream, you can do a process, if you can train a machine, if you train the process, I think you also, you have less people with the ability to have errors. We also have less people, and you can push that person that was doing the kind of mundane data collection and that kind of taking and survey 1, 2, 3 and collectors a prime example of that, where we traditionally have had pieces of paper and we dictated on a piece of paper and we send it to somebody for data entry. Like we've been able now with GIS to cut that down too, right? So again, that's kind of saving time and money. And so I want to talk about a case study real quick as I close. It's NGA. So it's the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. And guess what they have a problem with? Can somebody tell me?
Data.
Is that true? So the largest geospatial intelligence agency that does GIS has a huge problem with data. So just last month, they came out with this thing called the data strategy. And so basically, here are the things that they talked about. They said they have an issue with managing data as a strategic asset. So deploying federation of enterprise data frames, that's big. So what I just talked about previously, this is a prime example of an agency not kind of following the things that the prescribed issues that we talked about. Delivering data as a shared service, right? So not only, and trust me, NGA has zero issue with the collection and the storage and the asset of data. The problem is getting it to the right people, right? And then the scaling data. So how do we take data and the analytical processes that goes across the whole IC? So there are multiple agencies in the intelligence agency, but how do we push that data and scrub it where, and we got to understand that NGA is a classified agency. So IC is the intelligence community. So they're collecting data that sometimes, I think somebody talked about a food desert, right? There may be some data, well, I wouldn't say that, but there may be some data from a classified perspective that is beneficial in unclass, right? So how do they get that kind of data set and the analytics out? How can you do crowdsourcing, right? So can we have a spy plane that has a derived spy information and put that in an open source perspective? You know, those are the type of things. And then how do you, get it out from a broader analytical perspective, right? And then also literacy, right? So really teaching people, like I'm doing with you guys, is how do you understand and have a culture of data? Because most people think about the end product, but they never talk about, here is the thing that we first need to, the first thing we need to talk about is data. There's no maps, there's no imagery, there's no nothing without data. So data has to be captured to be processed and then to be able to derive a product. And so that is that. And so you guys can come, here is that, can you guys see this? So if you go to NGA's website, you'll see this document. I just wanted to kind of show you quickly. So again, it kind of talks about, some of the issues and how they operate with data. And I'll zoom in to see if you guys can see this.
You see the case study picture.
You don't see the PDF?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry. Give me 1 second. Now do you see the case study?
Yes.
Okay, now see, it says how will we operate? So again, collaborative space, but this is a conversation about their overall workforce. And so let me go back again. So this is the strategy document. So again, data governance. So how do we govern that piece? How do we share? How do we tag? Data quality, metadata standards. So things I just talked about. Data security. Those are things that NGA as an agency is looking at. And so they're looking at a steering committee and then data governance. So this is so there's data management and there's data governance. Data management is managing of the data. Data governance is managing the business rules and how do we operate with the exceptions of data, and then also having people who are data stewards. So these people are the folks that, from a day-to-day perspective, have a more hands-on approach with it. Then they roll it up to a data governance body. The data governance body says, hey, yes, we believe that this data needs to be changed. And if we make this one change, how does it affect all the business rules? So prime example for this is fire certifications, right? Maybe fire certification is in multiple systems, but I am over operations and I want to make a change. If I make this data change, even though you guys are using the data that we derive, how much impact would that be, right? And if it's no impact, then we can make a ruling to say, hey, we'll make that change, right? These are the data sets we want to change, this is the process, and it goes to a governance body. It's not one person making the change and then like, aha, like, oops, I didn't know you needed the same data set. So that's what this whole data governance process is as well. And then again, sharing data that I just talked about, the scalability of it. So from an analytical perspective, how do we get it out to a large community of folks? Bolstering data literacy in the workforce. So really kind of understanding how to use data, what's the importance of it, and again, basically about that presentation. So with that being said, I mean, it was a quick conversation about the importance of data. But again, I'm excited to be here and pending any questions. Thank you guys for this time, and I appreciate the opportunity to always be with young, bright, and brilliant minds.
Thank you so much, Kendrick. It was very powerful, and I believe so many things that you have shared are very interesting. And I do have one question, and I think I can open up the floor for other questions. So I did my master's in GIS, and then one of the topics I focused on was the Haiti earthquake, and then the actual project was looking at the earthquake and how we can create data in a more autonomous way, so we can help the disaster response team. And I know that you have so many good examples and experience in the disaster. You mentioned the Hurricane Sandy. So do you think the poorer communities, they probably have maybe less useful data when disaster happened, and how we can help these communities?
Yeah, so what people don't understand is, especially with FEMA, the people that need the FEMA help the most are poor people. So with FEMA, FEMA doesn't really support folks that have insurance, right? People that have family they can go to, right? So it's called IMPA. I is individual assistance, right? And so if you don't have insurance, there's a the max they'll give you is $35,000. So think about that. If you live in in California, what the $600,000 houses, right? Let's say if you're $34,000 a lot of money, right? So to go back to that, it is the poor people's data that need, right? Because those are the people that are going to need their resources more than anybody that can go to their crypto wallet or their bank account and be able to pull out $100,000 to go to Utah and restart their families. Poor folks are gonna struggle to be able to find rent because some of these people have been in these homes for 20 to 30 years. And so they have a cap, or they've had a relationship with the homeowner to say, hey, we've had an agreement that you pay me $500 for the last 20 years, whatever that is, right? But when the earthquake comes and that building is no longer, then where are they gonna go, right? They won't go, and then they won't have the food, and they won't have the resources. So I think that it is very important that identification of poor folks, education of poor folks, education of middle class poor folks, because every poor folks are not like, and then even still, like even our, it's called social vulnerability, which is the SOVI, which came out of South Carolina, and we use a lot of FEMA, was also people that have handicaps, right? So if you're blind, if you're elderly, if you're sick, nursing home folks, right? We saw that during COVID. We've seen that in Katrina. Like a lot of people that get affected the most are the people in the nursing home, right? And so being able to look at those kind of data sets, but then wrap around, repetitive services to ensure that we know where they're going, we know how many people are there, and we also know their needs, and doing a pre-need assessment. Because many times in disaster, we'll do a need assessment, but like these people are distressed. Like, think about it. Somebody punch you in your face now, you're like, where's my glasses, right? Like, no, you're trying to find your way, right? And then I think about where my glasses are at. That's how we should also look at some of our at-risk folks is, they're shell shocked, they've lost everything. And now you're asking them, what did you have in your house? Well, dude, I ain't got no house. Like, so what does it matter? So I think those are the type of things I think we should start to do from emergency perspective, and even in an earthquake perspective, there's going to be a lot of people that's going to lose a lot of stuff super fast and very fast, right? And there's going to be catastrophic damage of buildings and people that are going to instant, right? We just saw that in Haiti. So I think we need to have a better rhythm, especially you guys in California, that we got to work about how do we rapidly respond and also use data and tools and drones and seismic meters and those type of things now, and get very used to using those now, because most of the time we get proactive rather than reactive. We're most definitely reactive in many cases in emergencies.
Thank you so much. Is there any question, any comment? Please go ahead.
It must be lunchtime. They're ready to go to the next person. So
next presenter is Teraslinna, and she is the professional service lead and racial equity hub at ESRI. Chloe works as an analyst supporting the racial equity and social justice, and she helps organizations leverage location data to identify and address equity issues and advocates for interests of local communities. So Chloe, please take your time, and the floor is yours.
Sounds good. Thanks for that intro. Hopefully you all can see these slides, and it's not, can you all see this?
Yes.
Okay, cool. And it's not showing you the presenter view. That's good. Okay, so this is just kind of like going to be a high-level overview of racial equity and social justice with GIS, and how you can kind of think about applying that type of framework to the work you do. So racial equity is an increasing priority for many countries, especially the US. Over the last few years, it's really clear that policies and decisions related to our management of things like the pandemic have to be equitable. Economic recovery in this time needs to take into consideration the really long persisting inequities that have created and sustained poverty in a lot of cases in many communities of color and other historically marginalized communities. So today, this really is just going to be an overview of how GIS can be used as a tool to identify the root causes for inequity within communities. And I do have to credit Clinton Johnson and the rest of the racial equity team at ESRI for a lot of this content. It's super great to be able to be here and share this with you all. So this is just my intro slide. I was pretty much already introduced, but I work as an analyst at ESRI, supporting the racial equity and social justice team. And I'm definitely passionate about helping people leverage location data to identify and address a lot of those equity issues. Moving on here, what are disparities? Just to start off with a common definition here. Essentially, disparities place a higher burden on one group relative to another. So when that happens, racial disparities, for example, like those, and even more, there's a lot of intersections there when we think about intersectionality, but these types of disparities place a higher burden on certain individuals, families, and communities that other communities don't experience in the same way. So equity is very important, and it's important for all of us here to have a common understanding of what that is so that we're talking about the same thing. So these flowers are kind of like a visual for this, and I'm sure you've seen many things like this diagram before, but essentially what we are depicting here is that as flowers, we can really think of these as individuals, families, communities situated somewhere in society, and you can think of the ground the pots stand on as the foundation that those came before them were able to provide. So generational wealth, things like that. You can think of the fence posts between the flowers and the sun as the systemic barriers we all face of varying kinds and varying levels depending on what your background and identity is. And then you can think of the sun as the opportunity or resources that really contribute to the health, education, economic, and other social outcomes of the flowers. So as you can see here, each flower is not getting the same amount of access to the sun. And over time, their health and condition will continue to suffer in varying ways as a consequence. So equality here. So someone has decided to be fair and provide the same resource to each flower in this diagram. And we do call that equality. But ultimately, this approach is not actually fair. In fact, it increased disparities in some cases, if you'll notice, because some flowers are getting more sun than others, and one flower or community still isn't getting any access to the sun at all. So this is just meant to show that some policies might seek to be fair and try to provide the same resources to every person, family, or neighborhood, but in reality, this really requires a nuanced approach to be able to account for the different barriers people face. And we talk about this a lot in our GIS work, because without thinking of this in a very holistic way, oftentimes policies or different ways of doing an analysis don't actually address the need. And so in looking at equity here, to be more fair, organizations are really trying to provide resources that actually align with community needs. They want to create policies that allocate resources to these communities based on the different barriers they face. As you can see here, all the flowers are getting sun, and they have been addressed, that's been addressed in different ways. So that's essentially just a high level overview of how we're looking at these topics. And then the final phase of all of this is justice, because we know that true fairness in this context would be justice, which would be the removal of the barriers that are in the way of the flowers. So that those systemic barriers do take a lot of time and effort to counteract, which is why doing good quality analysis on a lot of these topics is really important. So just starting off here with racial and social inequities. These are many intrinsically and structurally linked barriers to equity. And these can look like a lot of different things. So this can look like health, food access, your access to housing. This can be jobs, workplace equity. It really covers everything. And we're really using GIS to try to identify policies that present barriers to some and make adjustments to ensure more justice for all people. So none of these topics really exist in a vacuum, which is why it's super vital to build an understanding of where issues are stemming from so that we actually know how to address them. So that's really where the GIS comes in. So how do we actually make equity an actionable thing? So starting off here, what is equity in the context of GIS? And the answer is kind of threefold. So I have a diagram for you all here, courtesy of Clinton. And first off, racial equity is a condition. This is a condition that is met when policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural messages no longer produce racial inequities. Second, racial equity is also a process. This is the work that's actually done to address these inequities, which would be eliminating policies, practices, attitudes that really sustain community conditions where the impacts are different by racial identity or other types of identities. And then the last piece here is the analysis. So being able to actually assess and identify that root cause is what's really important. And both the condition and process require analysis. So some assessment or root cause analysis of what's going on can actually accurately identify the source of inequities. And if you're doing that in the right way, the needs of communities get adequately addressed. But unfortunately, that more holistic view of all of these three pieces working together with racial equity as a condition, also as a process, and then an analysis piece, they often kind of are seen as separate. So we just wanted to really kind of share how those are all interrelated here to contextualize the GIS part of things. So in talking about what actually leads to inequitable outcomes, we have to break this down a bit more too, because what do we even mean when we are thinking about inequitable outcomes and we're trying to understand a community better? So racial equity best practices really recognize the relationships between the disparities and outcomes that communities face and the disparities in the community assets and conditions that really contributed to those outcomes. So conditions that contribute to those outcomes mean like the goal here is not just to assess and address a lot of the cases that are going on, but it's actually to identify, uplift, and amplify the things that we can do in these communities to drive positive outcomes. It's not just analysis, it's also about being able to do actionable things. So essentially decisions and practices is kind of the first step of what this all looks like. And these are the policies, programs, systems, and budget decisions that influence the circumstances that surround individuals, families, communities, and they impact how well they fare. So this includes historic and contemporary practices and decisions by governments, businesses, and those communities. And decisions and practices may create or uphold structural racism in a lot of cases, or other forms of discrimination. They can also involve bias against certain groups of people based on class, gender, race, other social groupings, and there can be inequitable distributions of resources. We see that a lot, especially in times of COVID with vaccine access and things like that. So it's really important to kind of start here and think about where these issues are stemming from upstream. So the second item here is community assets and conditions. These are the circumstances that surround individuals, families, and the communities where they are. So these include circumstances like access to quality healthcare, to education, to parks, to quality housing and what environmental conditions they live in, and many other conditions across a wide range of concerns. So as you can see, like the decisions and practices made by things like governments, they flow into these community assets and conditions that people experience every day. And then the last piece here is really the outcomes part of this. And this is much more visible than community assets and conditions. And this is essentially the indicators of how people fare. So how individuals, families, and their communities are actually faring socially and economically. So outcomes in this section could look like access to education. These topics that we hear all the time on the news, prevalence of severe and chronic diseases, food deserts, things like that, things we've heard about today, those are the actual outcomes. So when we think about all of these things as interconnected, it becomes less of a mystery where inequities are stemming from, and it helps us really do a better quality analysis when it comes to the GIS end of things, or if you work with any other types of analysis tools, it's useful for that as well. So starting off here, I'm kind of curious as to who here has ever taken out a loan. I'm guessing it would be a lot of people on this call, whether that's student loans, home loans, and in the context of home loans, if you're familiar with this topic, you may or may not be, but here's some background. Or it might be a refresher for some of you, but in the 1930s, this was called redlining, the map that you're seeing here, which means that essentially lines were drawn in cities across the country to separate neighborhoods. And the red areas you see were labeled as hazardous and declining, and the green areas were labeled as desirable and best. So essentially what this did was they codified patterns of racial segregation, and it resulted in massive disparities in who banks would lend to. So banks would actually use these zoning rules to determine who was worthy of credit. And people living in red neighborhoods would have had a lot of trouble obtaining mortgages for homes there, regardless of their credit worthiness. So now economists at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago and really around the world have been analyzing this and what the impacts have been. And they've determined that the consequences of these policy decisions not only continue to this day, but had incredibly unjust and race-based outcomes. So from their analysis, what does lack of access to credit actually mean for communities? We're thinking of these decisions that happened upstream, and then we're thinking of the actual outcome that people experienced. And in this case, this meant and still means today increased racial segregation, lower home ownership rates in red zone areas, lower home values, lower credit scores where these boundaries were drawn. It means less access to housing, credit, and wealth accumulation. If you can't buy a house, you can't really pass on generational wealth to your kids. If people can't get financing from housing from banks. It makes communities really susceptible to predatory lenders, which is, of course, not good. And oftentimes slumlords move in, they squeeze value from subdivided rental homes that might have otherwise been owned by families. And then any existing homeowners who want to use credit for maintenance and repairs on their home, which is standard for homeowners, this will just lead to further deterioration of properties if they can't get that credit. So these communities were disproportionately impacted by these policy choices, while in tandem, the people who were in the green zones were building generational wealth. So that's kind of some context here in case you were, needed a refresher on what redlining is at a high level. That's kind of the crash course I have for you today. So we're going to talk a little bit about urban heat islands in St. Louis, Missouri. So now that we know a little bit more about how redlining really contributed to the segregation of these neighborhoods, this is kind of an interesting man-made phenomenon that's worth exploring. So here we can see that the redlining here exists here. So we know that families and communities have faced some degree of a history of discrimination here. In this case, this was policies that impacted communities based on race, immigration status, and other social identities. So today we understand that this stemmed from redlining and racial covenants, but when we're looking at it with the lens of being someone trying to do a GIS analysis, sorry, I jumped ahead there, trying to do a GIS analysis, these are all really important factors to consider in understanding why these communities experience the outcomes that they are going through right now. So in looking at community assets and conditions for this, we want to think about how redlining and segregation have really been linked to a difference in temperature by neighborhoods. So this map aligns an analysis of temperatures on a particular day in the summer of 2019. And with this grading of historic redlining policies, HLLC, Polk Classic labels essentially, but the blue areas are cooler and the warm areas are more red essentially. So we're really going to focus on this grade A area right now. So when we're analyzing this part of this map, we're looking closely. We see that this area was graded as A or best, which means it's one of the temperature-wise coolest areas in St. Louis at that time. So these cooler temperatures have been linked to higher tree coverage and vegetation. And now, in contrast, this was an area that was graded as D or hazardous, and this is one of the warmest areas. There's a significant difference in the average temperature, and this is linked to lower tree coverage and less vegetation. So now that we understand that, as well as in this area, there's a high proportion of paved surfaces, and we know that these areas tend to be populated by historically marginalized communities. So the impact of urban heat islands is really just not proportionate. So in looking at the contrast between these two redlined community areas, through analysis, it's kind of, we found that the disparity in temperature leads to higher energy bills, higher preterm births, and lots of other negative impacts on chronic health conditions. And then when we combine this geospatial analysis with contextual information we know from history and other sources, in this case from the CDC, we know that urban heat islands have a deadly impact on cities like St. Louis and Baltimore. They are the cause of deaths related to heat, including heat stroke, respiratory disease, and other things, just to name a few. Heat islands and heat waves have been correlated to increases in hospital admissions for cardiovascular, kidney, and respiratory disorders. And it's expected that extreme summer heat events are going to be more frequent and more intense due to climate changes. So as our unhoused population in our country continues to climb each year, more and more communities, more and more marginalized people are going to be impacted by even things as small as where trees are planted in cities. So that's kind of an interesting analysis that would be really hard to do without thinking of it through a GIS equity lens. So if you're interested in learning more, we worked to develop some free GIS trainings on equity and social justice work. So feel free to scan these QR codes. And we just want to say that this is not work that you need like 3 Ivy League degrees and like, you know, tons of qualifications to do. You can start learning how to do this now, today, if it's something you're interested in, if there's some kind of community analysis you want to do. This is really great to get into. So this is a QR code for learn lessons that we've built out on different equity analyses. So this is specific to equity if you want to learn more about that in GIS. The second code here is for ESRI's MOOCs, the massive open online courses. They're free. They're great for students or anyone who might be new to GIS who just wants to understand what this is a little bit more. And then the third item here is a QR code to the Racial Equity Hub. So this is just where we're featuring work our customers are doing to support equity. So if these issues do interest you, I would encourage you to follow along and check back. It gets updated with new work. So yeah, that's essentially the main parts of this. I'm wondering if anyone has questions right now, and if not, that's fine.
I have one question.
Yeah.
So like, what are the features or factors that go into what you just said, like about like redlining? Like, there's obviously crime, and like I'm just wondering what factors go into it, like deciding which neighborhoods are A through D.
Yeah, and a lot of the redlining that occurred starting in the 1930s and progressed onward, it was the way that they identified high-risk neighborhoods. It was incredibly racially motivated. We have a lot of documentation now that shows that it was very intentional. So for example, I know in places like Chicago, Detroit, any area that had public housing, which in those areas was majority Black folks and Black communities living in those spaces, that was considered a red zone. That was like a pretty distinct choice that was made. So a lot of it is racially motivated, and there's a lot of history behind redlining too, so I don't want to oversimplify it, but that is those were some of the biggest drivers when those decisions were made. And banks are not supposed to use discriminatory policies now, but you know, the impacts of something like that carry through to this day, where we know that Black folks and other people of color, other marginalized groups get turned down for credit at much higher rates than other groups. So that is, yeah, I'm not sure if that is thorough enough.
Yeah, that's helpful too, but like, are there any other like features, like see like natural like earthquakes or whatever, natural disasters that go into it?
Like natural disasters that led to redlining, or that communities who have been redlined were affected more by natural disasters?
The latter.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the impacts. And I think it's really interesting when you think of it from a GIS perspective, because so many different things, including natural disasters, like when we think about Katrina, which, you know, that was already presented on today, that a lot of the people impacted and who had a lot of barriers put in their way to bounce back from that situation were Black folks in that area, and who got the least amount of aid. And if you layer maps over that with places that have been redlined that are majority Black communities, there's a lot of strong correlations there. And that's true with so many other types of equity as well. Even just looking at drinking fountain equity and things like that, where do people have access to water? That it still, a lot of it ties back to redlining. And same with commute times. and where they place highways, they'll usually place them through communities that have been redlined and don't have a lot of sway in those policy arguments. And then there's, you know, highways blasting through certain communities. And then if we think about, like, I think about Pasadena, California, they voted not to have a highway cut through Pasadena. So instead it creates way more traffic and goes through like East LA. And that was a policy decision from the 70s. So there's definitely a lot of different things like natural disasters that are really tied to sequestering people to certain geographic areas that were made historically.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any other questions, any feedback, comment? I do have one probably comment. I think you pointed out the mapping part that GIS helps to kind of create these visuals, and I think I want to link that to a role that Dr. Lauren Bent has at ESRI, which is looking at the visualization, spatial statistics, and I think the way we can visualize the information, the way we can usually look at the outcomes could actually show what are the factors that are going to be important or significant. So do you think that maybe the analysis type would also impact the way we are seeing all these causal effects, and maybe the analysis I do as a GIS expert at GIS analysis, maybe not really giving me the full perspective, because depending on the unit of analysis, I'm looking at the county or I'm looking at the block group, I may come up with totally different results.
Yeah, and that's definitely, I think that's any type of analysis is susceptible to that, right? Like what angle you're looking at it, the data will tell a completely different story. But I think that that's why historical context and being aware of whatever area you're researching is really important. Because if you just looked at something without context, anything like crime rates, and you were to put it on a map, it would tell a very different story than if you were to put context around it and say, well, this area is higher in crime or lower in crime, but also it's really high or low in education access or things like that. So I think that's why it's important in GIS, especially because of the impact we can have on local communities and other people, to be aware of a lot of what's going on, or else that whatever analysis you're doing, it might not have the impact you're intending, and it could even have negative impacts. But I mean, that's true of any data analysis, right?
Thank you so much. I just want to thank Chloe for a very powerful presentation, and I will ask Dr. Kumar to provide the closing remarks, and then we can go ahead and share of course, the video is recorded, is going to be shared with everyone. Also, I try to gather the presentations, and if possible, I put it on a story map, so the link would be also added. And then, of course, everyone who has any questions, you can always reach out to me or any of the presenters. They provided a contact information.
Thank you. Thanks, Mehrdad. I'd also like to add my thanks to our three presenters, Dafna, Kendrick, and Chloe. A lot of food for thought. And especially Chloe on the whole equality versus equity, and what can we do about the equity part of it. It's a huge thing for our university, so it's something very important for us. So thank you for sharing your perspective. I know it's in a lot in the news recently with the infrastructure bill. There was talk about possibly it being a vehicle for addressing some of the historical equity issues. So very, very contemporary. And I also want to thank Eric, our dean, and Mehrdad, because the two of you have been instrumental in increasing the level of awareness and interest in GIS in our college. So College of Business historically has not been very much in the GIS sphere, but over the last couple of years, we have really increased the visibility. So thank you for that. And I would like to also thank everyone for attending and joining us here. And as Mehrdad said, we will be posting it to our website. And here is the community survey. If you haven't taken it yet, please go ahead and take that. It will help. It's a survey 123 that is designed to see where there might be some inequities and what can be done about it. With that, thanks everyone.
Thank you, everyone, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day. And thank you for attending, and thank you for all of the presenters for very insightful presentations and talks.